T-Rex saves a lost human in the jungle. What happens next will melt your heart. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The jungle was alive with sound. Birds shrieked from the dense canopy, their calls echoing like whistles through the humid air. Insects buzzed incessantly, and the soft rustle of leaves hinted at unseen creatures moving just out of sight. The deeper Jake wandered, the louder the jungle became, as though mocking him, reminding him that he was an intruder in its wild, untamed heart. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, his shirt clinging to him as he squinted at the sliver of sunlight cutting through the tangled branches overhead. It had been hours, maybe days, since he'd been separated from his team. His pack, which once carried supplies, now held only a half-empty water bottle, a flashlight with dying batteries, and a useless map smudged beyond recognition. "Where the heck am I?" Jake muttered, his voice hoarse from thirst and frustration. The jungle, of course, offered no answer. He paused to catch his breath, leaning against the trunk of an enormous tree. Its bark was rough under his hand, and vines coiled around it like snakes. His legs burned from hours of trudging over uneven ground, through mud and roots that threatened to trip him at every step. "I just need to find a river," he said aloud, as though convincing himself. "Rivers lead to civilization. Everyone knows that." A sharp crack echoed from somewhere behind him. Jake froze. He spun around, his pulse thundering in his ears as he scanned the underbrush. The trees seemed to close in around him, their shadows shifting ominously as the jungle sounds grew softer, quieter, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice trembling. He cursed himself silently. "Brilliant idea, Jake. Yell into the jungle and invite whatever's out there to come get you." Silence. And then, another sound. A low, rhythmic thud. Jake frowned, turning back toward the path he had been following. At first, he thought it might be distant drums. But as the sound grew louder, it became clear. This wasn't drumming. It was footsteps. Heavy, earth-shaking footsteps that sent faint vibrations through the ground beneath him. "What the?" Jake backed away, his heart hammering as the sound grew closer, louder. Branches snapped like twigs somewhere ahead, and a shadow, large and hulking, moved between the trees. "This isn't possible." The thought rang through Jake's mind as he watched in stunned silence. A creature, a dinosaur, emerged from the jungle. Tyrannosaurus Rex. Jake's knees nearly buckled. His mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. The dinosaur's massive head loomed above the trees, its serrated teeth visible as its jaws opened slightly, releasing a low rumbling sound that shook the air. Its scales were a mix of deep green and brown, blending almost perfectly with the foliage, and its muscular legs moved with terrifying grace as it stepped into the clearing. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. The T-Rex stopped just a few yards away, its golden eyes locking onto Jake. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jake felt like a mouse caught in the gaze of a hawk, small, fragile, and utterly doomed. "This isn't happening," Jake whispered, his voice shaking. "This can't be happening." The T-Rex let out another rumbling sound, its chest vibrating with the force of it. Jake flinched, bracing himself for the worst. His mind conjured images of sharp teeth, crushing jaws, and a quick, brutal end. But the dinosaur didn't move. It simply stared at him, its massive head tilting slightly to the side, as though curious. Jake blinked, his fear momentarily giving way to confusion. What are you doing?" The T-Rex huffed, a sound that might have been a breath or something else entirely. Then, to Jake's astonishment, the dinosaur turned its head slightly and looked toward the path Jake had been following, as though pointing the way. Jake's jaw dropped. "You've got to be kidding me." The T-Rex looked back at him, its golden eyes still calm and unervingly intelligent. Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. Okay, he muttered, more to himself than to the dinosaur. "You're hallucinating. This is dehydration. Lack of food. Dinosaurs don't exist. Not anymore." The T-Rex let out another low rumble, and Jake flinched again. But it still didn't attack. Just waited. Finally, with his heart still pounding, Jake took a cautious step forward. Then another. The T-Rex shifted slightly, its gaze following him as he moved toward the path it had indicated. "Are you helping me?" Jake asked aloud, feeling ridiculous for talking to a creature that couldn't possibly understand him. The dinosaur made no reply, of course, but it stepped back slightly, giving Jake room to move. Taking a deep breath, Jake moved past the creature, his eyes never leaving its massive form. Every instinct told him to run, to get as far away as possible. But something about the dinosaur's behavior, its calm stillness, the lack of aggression, made him hesitate. As he walked down the narrow path, he glanced back over his shoulder. The T-Rex was following him. Not charging, not hunting, just walking, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground but somehow not feeling threatening. "I must be losing my mind," Jake muttered, turning his attention back to the path. Hours passed as Jake continued through the jungle, the T-Rex never far behind. At first, it had been terrifying. Every time the ground shook beneath him, every time he heard the sharp snap of branches, his instincts screamed that he was being hunted. But the dinosaur never came closer than a few yards, never showed any sign of aggression. Gradually, Jake's fear began to ease, replaced by something stranger: curiosity. "What are you?" Jake said at one point, glancing back at the massive creature. "You're not supposed to exist." The T-Rex let out a low huff, its golden eyes watching him closely. Jake shook his head, laughing humorlessly. "Great. I'm talking to a dinosaur now. Maybe I have lost my mind." The sun was beginning to set by the time Jake stumbled into a clearing. His legs ached, and his stomach grumbled loudly, reminding him how long it had been since he'd eaten anything. He dropped his pack onto the ground and collapsed onto a fallen log, letting out a long, exhausted sigh. The T-Rex stepped into the clearing a moment later, its massive form partially silhouetted against the orange glow of the setting sun. Jake tensed slightly out of habit, but the dinosaur simply lowered itself onto the ground with a heavy thud, resting its head on its enormous front claws. Jake blinked at it, stunned. Are you tired too?" The T-Rex let out a sound that almost sounded like a sigh, its eyes half closing as though content to rest. Jake stared at it for a long moment, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're supposed to be the king of predators," he muttered. "And here you are, lying around like some oversized dog." The dinosaur didn't react, its breathing slow and steady. Jake reached into his pack and pulled out his water bottle, taking a small sip before setting it aside. "You know," he said, glancing at the T-Rex, "you're not half as scary as I thought you'd be." The dinosaur opened one eye, watching him quietly. Jake laughed softly, running a hand through his dirty, sweat-soaked hair. "What am I doing? I'm sitting here talking to a dinosaur like it's my buddy." But in a strange way, it did feel like the creature understood him. Like it wasn't just some mindless predator but something more. "Rexy," Jake said suddenly, testing the name out loud. "Yeah, that suits you. Rexy the T-Rex." Rexy let out a low huff, almost as though approving of the name. Jake grinned, shaking his head. "Okay, Rexy, here's the deal. You don't eat me, and I'll keep you company while we figure out how to get me out of this jungle." The dinosaur didn't respond, of course, but Jake took its calm presence as a good sign. As darkness fell over the clearing, Jake stretched out on the ground, his head resting on his pack as he stared up at the stars beginning to appear through the gaps in the trees. Rexy stayed nearby, a dark shape barely visible in the shadows, its breathing steady and rhythmic like distant thunder. For the first time since getting lost, Jake didn't feel completely alone. "I don't know how you're here," he murmured, his eyes growing heavy, "but I think you saved me today. So, thanks, Rexy." Rexy let out a soft, rumbling sound, and Jake smiled faintly as he drifted off to sleep, the jungle humming quietly around them. Jake awoke with a start, the morning sun piercing through the thick canopy of the jungle. For a moment, he forgot where he was, his heart pounding as he sat up and scanned his surroundings. The events of the previous day came rushing back, The jungle, the disorientation, the impossible encounter with the dinosaur that now lay curled up a few yards away. Rexy. Jake stared at the massive creature, still stunned by its presence. It looked peaceful, almost calm, as it rested in the clearing. The dinosaur's chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. Its massive tail sprawled across the ground like a fallen log. "I'm still not dreaming," Jake murmured, rubbing his eyes. "This is actually happening." Rexy's golden eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, and the dinosaur let out a low rumble. A sound that, by now, Jake had begun to recognize as a greeting. Despite everything, Jake smiled faintly. "Good morning to you too, big guy." Standing up, Jake stretched his stiff limbs, groaning as the aches and pains from yesterday's hike made themselves known. His stomach growled, the hollow emptiness reminding him that he hadn't eaten in over a day. "Great," Jake muttered, glancing down at his pack. He dug through it, pulling out the last half-full water bottle and a granola bar he'd forgotten about. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He unwrapped the bar and took a small bite, savoring the sweet, nutty taste as though it were a 5-course meal. Rexy tilted his massive head, watching Jake intently. Jake laughed softly, holding up the granola bar. "Sorry, buddy. You wouldn't want this anyway. Not exactly a T-Rex-sized snack." Rexy blinked, his golden eyes unblinking as he continued to stare. Then, with a deep huff, the dinosaur pushed himself up, the ground trembling faintly beneath his weight. Jake froze as Rexy turned toward the trees, his head swinging back and forth as though searching for something. "What are you up to?" Jake asked cautiously. He watched in disbelief as Rexy lumbered toward the edge of the clearing, using his massive jaws to pluck a low-hanging branch from a nearby tree. Jake's jaw dropped. Are you eating leaves?" Rexy turned back toward Jake, the branch still dangling from his teeth. The dinosaur let out a low rumble as though to say, "What about it?" Jake stared for a moment before shaking his head with a soft laugh. "Okay, so you're not just a meat eater. Who knew?" Rexy dropped the branch with a thud and let out a soft huff, his tail swishing behind him as he turned back toward the jungle. Jake couldn't help but marvel at the creature's behavior. For a dinosaur that was supposed to be the fiercest predator to ever walk the earth, Rexy seemed more like a gentle giant than a monster. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Jake muttered, finishing the last bite of his granola bar. Rexy let out a low rumble, turning his head back to glance at Jake as though waiting for him. Jake frowned, grabbing his pack as he stood up. "You want me to follow you, don't you?" Rexy didn't move, but the look in his eyes was unmistakable. Slinging the pack over his shoulder, Jake sighed. All right, lead the way, Rexy. Not like I have any better ideas." They set off through the jungle, Rexy walking a few steps ahead of Jake as though acting as a guide. The path they followed wasn't marked, but Rexy seemed to know where he was going. Jake kept a careful distance, his eyes darting between the dinosaur and the surrounding trees. The jungle was alive with movement, but the smaller creatures seemed to give Rexy a wide berth. Birds scattered as the massive dinosaur passed beneath them, and even the rustling sounds of other animals faded into silence. It was as though the jungle itself respected Rexy's presence. "This is so surreal," Jake muttered to himself, stepping over a thick root. "How is any of this even possible?" He thought back to his team, his friends, who were probably still out there somewhere, searching for him. Or maybe they'd already left. Maybe they thought he was gone for good. The thought sent a chill through him, and he shook his head, focusing instead on the dinosaur leading the way. "Rexy," Jake said, his voice breaking the jungle's quiet. "Do you know where we're going? Are you just wandering? Or?" Rexy didn't respond, of course, but the dinosaur paused suddenly at the edge of a shallow stream. Jake stumbled to a stop beside him, his breath catching as he watched Rexy lower his massive head to the water. Jake stared for a moment before dropping to his knees beside the stream, his exhaustion forgotten. "Water," he whispered, his voice filled with relief. He cupped his hands, scooping the cool, clear liquid into his mouth. The water was clean, fresh, and Jake drank greedily, feeling strength return to his tired body. "Thank you, Rexy," he said quietly, glancing up at the dinosaur. Rexy lifted his head, water dripping from his jaws as he let out a soft huff, his golden eyes watching Jake carefully. Jake grinned faintly. "You're a lifesaver. You know that?" Rexy rumbled softly, turning his head to glance at the jungle beyond the stream. Jake followed his gaze, frowning slightly. "What is it?" Before he could process what was happening, Rexy let out a deep, rumbling growl, a sound so low it made the ground vibrate beneath Jake's hands. The dinosaur's entire body tensed, his golden eyes narrowing as he stared into the trees. Jake's blood ran cold. "Rexy, what's wrong?" From the jungle came a new sound, low, guttural snarls that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. He turned slowly, his heart pounding as he spotted a pair of glowing yellow eyes watching them from the shadows. Then another, and another. "Great," Jake muttered, stumbling back. "Now what?" A jaguar slinked out of the trees, its sleek body low to the ground as it stalked toward them. Its sharp teeth flashed as it let out a deep snarl, its gaze fixed on Jake. Two more jaguars emerged behind it, their eyes gleaming with hunger. Jake scrambled backward, panic surging through him. "Oh no, 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 no." Rexy's growl deepened, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the very air around them. The jaguars paused, their ears flattening against their heads as they stared up at the enormous dinosaur towering over them. Jake glanced at Rexy, his heart still pounding. "You've got this, right, big guy?" Rexy let out a roar, a deep, earth-shaking sound that sent birds scattering from the treetops. The jaguars snarled in response, but it was clear they were outmatched. Slowly, reluctantly, they backed away into the jungle, disappearing into the shadows. Jake exhaled sharply, his entire body trembling as the tension eased. "I can't believe that just happened," he muttered, glancing up at Rexy. "You scared them off." Rexy lowered his head, letting out a soft rumble as though to check on Jake. "I'm fine," Jake said quickly, brushing dirt off his pants as he stood up. "I think I owe you one, though." Rexy blinked slowly, his golden eyes calm once more. Jake stared up at the dinosaur, shaking his head in amazement. "You're not just a dinosaur," he said softly. "You're my protector, aren't you?" Rexy didn't respond, but in that moment, Jake felt certain of one thing. He wasn't alone anymore. They continued on, the jungle stretching endlessly before them. But now, Jake felt a strange sense of comfort knowing Rexy was with him. The dinosaur, once a creature of nightmares, had become something more. Something Jake couldn't quite explain. By the time the sun began to set again, Jake spotted something in the distance, a flicker of smoke rising above the trees. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Smoke," he whispered, his voice filled with hope. "That's got to be my team. That's got to be them." He turned to Rexy, his heart racing. "We found them. I think we found them." Rexy let out a soft huff, tilting his head as though studying Jake's excitement. Without hesitation, Jake started toward the smoke, his steps quick and eager. Rexy followed close behind, his massive form moving with surprising grace through the trees. For the first time in days, Jake felt hope. He wasn't sure what would happen when he reunited with his team, if they would believe his story, if they would understand. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't have made it without Rexy. Jake pushed through the dense undergrowth, branches scratching at his arms and legs as he hurried toward the rising smoke. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of hope and disbelief propelling him forward. Could it really be his team? Could this nightmare finally be coming to an end? Behind him, Rexy followed closely, his heavy footsteps shaking the ground with every step. The dinosaur's presence, which had once filled Jake with terror, now felt like reassurance, like an invisible shield protecting him from whatever dangers the jungle might throw his way. As they climbed a small hill, Jake finally caught a glimpse of the clearing up ahead. His breath hitched as he spotted a group of tents, a roaring campfire, and familiar figures moving about. His team. "Oh my God," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "It's them. It's really them." Without thinking, he broke into a run. "Hey!" he shouted, waving his arms as he stumbled down the hill. "Guys, it's me. It's Jake." The figures in the camp froze, turning toward the sound of his voice. A moment later, someone shouted his name, and the camp erupted into chaos as his teammates came running toward him. "Jake! Holy! Jake, you're alive!" Jake barely had time to process what was happening before he was surrounded. His teammates grabbing his shoulders, patting his back, and bombarding him with questions. "Where the heck have you been? We thought you were gone, man. How did you survive out there?" Jake opened his mouth to answer, but before he could say a word, the ground trembled. A familiar thud, thud, thud echoed through the clearing, and the excited chatter fell silent as the team turned to stare at the hill Jake had just descended. And then they saw him, Rexy. The T-Rex's massive head appeared over the crest of the hill, his golden eyes scanning the camp as he lumbered forward. His footsteps shook the earth, and a low rumble escaped his throat, a sound that sent birds scattering from the trees. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then, "Dinosaur!" someone screamed. The camp erupted into chaos. People scattered in every direction, knocking over tents and shouting in panic. "Run! Jake! What did you do? Is that a T-Rex?" Jake spun around, holding up his hands. "Wait! Stop! Don't run!" But no one was listening. His teammates bolted for the trees, their screams echoing through the clearing as Rexy came to a stop at the edge of the camp. The dinosaur let out a low rumble, tilting his massive head as though confused by the sudden commotion. Jake turned back to Rexy, his heart sinking. "It's okay, Rexy," he said quickly, stepping toward the dinosaur. "They're just scared. They don't understand." Rexy huffed softly, his golden eyes watching Jake closely. "Guys!" Jake shouted, spinning back toward his team. "Stop running. He's not dangerous. I swear." From the edge of the clearing, one of his teammates, a man named Tyler, peered out from behind a tree, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Jake, are you insane? That's a T-Rex. It's going to eat us." "No, he's not," Jake insisted. "He saved me. He's the reason I'm alive." Tyler stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're telling me that thing saved you?" "Yes," Jake said, his voice firm. "Look, I know how it sounds, but you have to trust me. Rexy isn't like other dinosaurs. He's different. He's my friend." Tyler's mouth opened and closed, as though searching for the right words. "Your friend? Jake, listen to yourself. You're talking about a T-Rex." Before Jake could respond, Rexy let out a low rumble, drawing everyone's attention back to him. The dinosaur lowered his massive head, his golden eyes scanning the terrified group as though trying to make sense of their fear. Jake stepped forward, his hands outstretched in a calming gesture. "It's okay, Rexy," he said softly. "They're just scared. They don't know you like I do." To his amazement, Rexy seemed to relax at the sound of his voice. The dinosaur let out a soft huff, his tail swishing behind him as he settled onto the ground with a heavy thud. The earth trembled, but the movement felt less like a threat and more like reassurance. Jake turned back to his team, his expression pleading. "See? He's not hurting anyone. He's not trying to attack us. He's just here." Slowly, Tyler stepped out from behind the tree, his eyes still locked on Rexy. "This is insane," he muttered. "Completely insane." "Yeah, well," Jake said with a tired laugh, "that's kind of been my week." One by one, the rest of the team began to emerge from their hiding spots, their expressions a mix of fear, awe, and disbelief. No one spoke as they stared at the enormous dinosaur lying calmly at the edge of the camp. Finally, a woman named Sarah broke the silence. "Jake, how is this even possible?" Jake shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know where he came from, or how he's here. All I know is that Rexy saved my life. I was lost and alone, and he protected me." Tyler snorted softly, shaking his head. "This is like something out of a movie." "Yeah," Jake said, glancing back at Rexy with a small smile. "It kind of is." As the hours passed, the tension in the camp began to ease. Rexy stayed where he was, his massive form still and calm as the team cautiously went about their business. No one dared to get too close, but they stopped running, their curiosity slowly outweighing their fear. Jake sat near the fire, eating his first real meal in days as he watched Rexy from a distance. The dinosaur's golden eyes were half closed, his breathing slow and steady as he rested. "You really are something else, aren't you?" Jake murmured to himself. Tyler sat down beside him, shaking his head as he stared at the dinosaur. "So what's the plan, Jake? You're not seriously thinking about keeping him, are you?" Jake laughed softly. "He's not a pet, Tyler. I don't know what he is, but I'm not leaving him behind." Tyler frowned. "And what happens when he decides he's hungry? Or when someone else finds him and freaks out? You can't just take a T-Rex home with you." Jake's smile faded as he looked back at Rexy. Deep down, he knew Tyler was right. As much as he wanted to stay with Rexy, to keep him safe, he knew it wasn't possible. Rexy didn't belong here or anywhere, really. He was a living impossibility, and Jake had no idea what the future held for him. "I'll figure it out," Jake said quietly. "I owe him that much." Tyler stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. "You're crazy, man. You know that?" Jake grinned faintly. "Yeah, I've heard that before." That night, as the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Jake sat near Rexy at the edge of the clearing. The firelight flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the jungle floor. "Hey, big guy," Jake said softly, leaning back against a tree as he looked up at the dinosaur. "I don't know how much longer we've got together, but thanks for everything." Rexy let out a low rumble, his golden eyes watching Jake with a calm intelligence that still took his breath away. Jake smiled, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're my hero, you know that?" Rexy huffed softly, the sound almost like a sigh. Jake closed his eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of Rexy's breathing, and for the first time in a long time, he felt completely at peace. The night was calm, and the camp settled into uneasy stillness. The only sounds were the occasional pop of the fire and the rhythmic breathing of Rexy, whose massive form rested just beyond the tents. To Jake, the dinosaur seemed both impossibly real and yet entirely out of place, a creature of myth standing in the middle of their ordinary lives. Unable to sleep, Jake sat by the fire, staring into the flames as his thoughts spun like a whirlwind. Tyler's words earlier haunted him. "You can't just take a T-Rex home with you." Of course, Tyler was right. Rexy didn't belong here, at least not in the world Jake knew. But what did that mean for Rexy? Would they leave him here? Would someone call the authorities who would come and do what? Capture him? Study him? Destroy him out of fear? Jake shuddered at the thought. He couldn't let that happen. Not to Rexy. The dinosaur's deep, rumbling breath broke through Jake's thoughts, and he glanced toward the edge of the clearing where Rexy lay. Even in sleep, the massive creature looked watchful, protective, like some ancient guardian brought back to life. "Jake!" The voice made him jump, and he turned to see Sarah walking toward him, her arms crossed against the chill of the night air. She stopped by the fire, her eyes flicking toward Rexy. "Can't sleep?" Jake shook his head. "No. You?" Sarah shrugged, sitting down across from him. "Hard to sleep when there's a dinosaur hanging out by the tents." Jake smirked faintly. "Fair point." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly between them, and the jungle hummed with distant sounds. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Jake, what are we going to do about him?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I've been trying to figure that out all night." Sarah's gaze softened as she studied him. "You care about him, don't you?" Jake nodded slowly, staring into the fire. "Yeah, I do. I wouldn't be alive if it weren't for him. He saved me, Sarah, more than once. And it's not just that. He's not what you'd expect." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "He's a T-Rex, Jake." "I know," Jake said quickly, "but he's different. He's not some mindless predator. He's smart, gentle even. It's like..." He trailed off, searching for the right words. "It's like he understands me." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. So what happens now? We can't keep him hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone's going to see him. Jake's stomach tightened. I know, he admitted, but I can't just leave him. Not after everything he's done for me. Sarah nodded, glancing toward Rexy. The dinosaur shifted slightly in his sleep, his tail swishing gently against the ground. He doesn't look so scary when he's like that, she murmured. Jake smiled faintly. No, he doesn't. For a long time, they sat in silence, watching the fire. Finally, Sarah stood, brushing dirt off her pants. Get some rest, Jake. We'll figure this out tomorrow. Jake watched her walk back toward the tents, her silhouette fading into the shadows. He glanced toward Rexy one last time before lying back on the ground, his head resting against his pack. Tomorrow, he whispered softly. We'll figure it out tomorrow. Morning came far too quickly. The first light of dawn crept through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Jake woke to the sound of murmured voices and the faint clatter of equipment. He sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes as he glanced around. The camp was already bustling with activity. Tyler and a few others were huddled together near the fire, talking in low voices and occasionally glancing toward Rexy, who stood at the edge of the clearing. The dinosaur was awake now, his golden eyes watching the group warily, his tail flicking in slow, deliberate movements. Jake frowned, grabbing his pack as he stood up. Something about the way Tyler and the others were acting set him on edge. What's going on? Jake asked as he approached the group. Tyler looked up, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, Jake. Jake's stomach twisted. About what? Tyler glanced toward Rexy, then back at Jake. About him. Look, I get it. You think this thing saved your life, and maybe it did. But we can't just ignore the fact that it's a T-Rex. Jake's jaw clenched. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to call this in, Tyler said firmly. The authorities, scientists, whoever. People need to know about this. We can't just leave it here. Jake shook his head, his heart pounding. No, you can't do that. Tyler frowned. Jake, be reasonable. This isn't some pet you can take home. It's a dinosaur. It doesn't belong here. And what do you think they're going to do to him? Jake shot back, his voice rising. You think they're going to study him? Protect him? No, they're going to put him in a cage. Or worse, they'll kill him because they don't understand him. Tyler hesitated, but his expression hardened. We don't have a choice. This is bigger than us, Jake. Jake took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. Rexy saved my life. He's not dangerous. He doesn't deserve this. Before Tyler could respond, a low rumble echoed through the clearing. The ground trembled, and everyone turned as Rexy stepped forward, his golden eyes fixed on the group. The dinosaur let out a soft growl, his tail swishing as though sensing the tension in the air. Jake glanced at him, his voice softening. It's okay, Rexy. They're just scared. Rexy huffed softly, his gaze flicking between Jake and the others. Tyler took a cautious step back. Jake, this is insane. You can't control it. You don't know what it's capable of. Jake turned on him, his voice steady and firm. I know exactly what he's capable of. He's capable of loyalty, of protecting someone who needed help. He's not a monster, Tyler. Tyler stared at him, his expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. This isn't going to end well, Jake. Jake ignored him, turning back to Rexy. He walked toward the dinosaur slowly, his hands held out in a calming gesture. It's okay, big guy. I'm here. Rexy let out a low, rumbling sound, his head lowering slightly as he watched Jake approach. The dinosaur's massive form loomed over him, but Jake felt no fear, only a strange sense of connection, like he and Rexy understood each other in a way no one else could. I won't let them hurt you, Jake whispered, reaching out to touch Rexy's snout. I promise. Rexy huffed softly, the warm air from his breath ruffling Jake's hair. From behind him, Jake heard Tyler mutter something under his breath, but he didn't care. He wouldn't let anyone take Rexy away, not after everything they had been through. We'll figure this out, Jake said softly, more to himself than to Rexy. I don't know how, but we will. The dinosaur tilted his head slightly, his golden eyes calm and steady. Jake smiled faintly, his hands still resting against Rexy's rough scales. You're not alone anymore, he murmured. And neither am I. The tension in the camp remained thick as the day wore on. Tyler and the others kept their distance, their conversations hushed as they watched Rexy warily. Jake stayed close to the dinosaur, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to do next. Rexy didn't belong here. Jake knew that. But he also knew he couldn't let anyone hurt him. The dinosaur had saved his life, and now it was Jake's turn to return the favor. As the sun began to set, Jake made a decision. He glanced at Rexy, then at the jungle beyond the clearing. Come on, big guy, he said softly. We're leaving. Rexy tilted his head, letting out a low rumble as though questioning him. Jake smiled faintly. Trust me, it's better this way. He grabbed his pack, slinging it over his shoulder as he turned toward the trees. Rexy hesitated for a moment, then followed, his footsteps shaking the ground as they disappeared into the jungle. The jungle seemed darker as Jake and Rexy moved away from the camp. The dim light of the setting sun filtered through the thick canopy, casting long shadows across the ground. Jake pushed forward, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he glanced over his shoulder to make sure Rexy was following. The massive dinosaur moved quietly for something so large, his golden eyes scanning the trees with calm focus. Come on, Rexy, Jake whispered, his voice low. We need to keep moving before they catch up. He knew Tyler and the others wouldn't let this go. If they realized he had left with Rexy, they'd come after him. Maybe they'd call in help, people with guns, scientists, or worse. He couldn't let that happen. Rexy had saved him, time and time again, and now it was Jake's turn to protect him. The jungle thickened as they pressed on, vines and roots snaring at Jake's feet. His arms ached from pushing branches aside, but he didn't stop. Every time he faltered, Rexy let out a low, reassuring rumble from behind him, as though urging him forward. I'm okay, Jake muttered, glancing back with a small, tired smile. We'll find a place to rest soon. Rexy blinked slowly, his head tilting slightly as though he understood. By the time night fell completely, Jake's legs felt like lead. The jungle was alive with the sounds of insects, distant hoots of birds, and the occasional growl of something lurking unseen. But Jake wasn't afraid, not with Rexy beside him. Finally, they reached a small clearing bordered by towering trees. A gentle stream cut through the middle of it, its water glinting faintly in the moonlight. Jake dropped his pack onto the ground and collapsed beside it, letting out a long sigh. This is good, he murmured, leaning back against a tree trunk. We'll stop here for the night. Rexy stepped carefully into the clearing, his massive feet pressing into the soft earth as he looked around. The dinosaur let out a low huff, his golden eyes scanning the darkness before he settled down at the edge of the clearing, his tail curled protectively around him. Jake watched him for a moment, still in awe of the creature's gentleness. He reached into his pack and pulled out the last of his water, taking a slow sip before setting the bottle aside. You're probably hungry, huh? Jake said quietly, glancing at Rexy. I don't really have anything for you. Sorry, big guy. Rexy let out a soft rumble, tilting his head slightly. Jake smiled faintly. I don't know what I'd do without you, he admitted, his voice soft. When I got lost out here, I thought I was done for. But then you showed up. And now, I don't know. It's like you were meant to find me. Rexy huffed in response, the sound gentle and low. Jake pulled his knees up to his chest, resting his chin on them as he stared out at the jungle beyond the clearing. You don't belong here either, you know, he said quietly. We're both lost in a way. The jungle answered with its usual hum, crickets chirping, leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Jake closed his eyes, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Don't worry, Rexy, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll figure this out. Promise. Jake awoke suddenly to the sound of something moving in the darkness. His heart leapt into his throat as he sat up, his eyes darting around the clearing. The jungle was darker than ever, the moon now hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. "Rexy," he whispered, his voice shaky. Rexy was already on his feet, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The dinosaur's massive head swung toward the far edge of the clearing, where the shadows seemed thicker, darker, wrong. Jake's blood ran cold as he heard it. Footsteps. Human footsteps. "Jake!" A voice called out, sharp and angry. "We know you're out here, Tyler." Jake's heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet, grabbing his pack and slinging it over his shoulder. "They found us," he muttered, turning to Rexy. "We have to go." But Rexy didn't move. The dinosaur's body tensed, his tail swishing sharply as he let out a low, rumbling growl that sent shivers down Jake's spine. "Jake!" Tyler's voice came again, closer this time. "Come on, man. This is crazy. You can't run forever." Jake gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He didn't want to leave this clearing. It felt safe, hidden, but he knew they couldn't stay. If Tyler and the others found Rexy, there was no telling what would happen. "Rexy, come on," Jake whispered urgently, stepping toward the dinosaur. "We have to move." Rexy's growl deepened, the sound vibrating through the ground beneath Jake's feet. He turned sharply as Tyler and two other teammates stepped into the clearing, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "There you are," Tyler said, his voice filled with relief and anger. "Jake, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Jake stood his ground, his fists clenched. "I'm protecting him," he shot back. "He doesn't deserve this." Tyler's flashlight swung toward Rexy, and his face paled as the dinosaur let out a sharp, warning roar. "Jake, this thing is dangerous. It's a T-Rex. You're risking all of our lives by keeping it alive." "He's not dangerous," Jake shouted. "He's saved me more times than I can count. He's not a monster." Tyler's expression hardened. "You don't know that. You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment." He turned to the others. "We need to call this in. Now." "No!" Jake stepped between them and Rexy, his voice trembling with desperation. "You don't understand. If you call anyone, they'll come after him. They'll hurt him. I can't let that happen." Tyler hesitated, his expression flickering with doubt. "Jake, please," Jake said softly, his voice breaking. "You don't know what he's done for me. He's not just some animal. He's my friend." The clearing fell silent. Tyler stared at Jake for a long moment, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Behind him, the other teammates exchanged uncertain glances, their fear warring with curiosity. And then, the ground shook. A deep, guttural roar erupted from somewhere in the jungle, louder and more menacing than anything Jake had heard before. Rexy's head shot up, his golden eyes narrowing as he let out a sharp, answering roar. "What was that?" one of the teammates whispered, his voice trembling. Jake's stomach twisted as the roar echoed again, closer this time. He turned to Rexy, who was already moving toward the sound, his massive form tensed and ready. "Something's coming," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with dread. Tyler's face paled. "We need to get out of here. Now." Jake shook his head. "No, I'm staying with Rexy." "Jake?" Before Tyler could argue, the jungle erupted in chaos. Trees snapped like twigs as something massive crashed through the undergrowth. A second dinosaur, a predator even larger than Rexy, emerged from the shadows, its eyes gleaming red in the darkness. Jake's breath caught in his throat. "What is that?" The creature let out a deafening roar, its jaws snapping as it charged into the clearing. Rexy stepped forward, his own roar echoing like thunder as he positioned himself between Jake and the new threat. "Rexy, no!" Jake shouted, but the T-Rex ignored him. The two dinosaurs clashed with a force that shook the ground, their roars filling the air as they snapped and lunged at each other. Trees splintered and fell as the massive creatures fought, their tails whipping through the air like wrecking balls. "Jake, we have to go!" Tyler shouted, grabbing Jake's arm. But Jake refused to move, his eyes fixed on Rexy as the dinosaur fought to protect him. "I can't leave him. Jake!" Tyler's voice was desperate, but Jake barely heard him. All he could see was Rexy, his friend, risking everything to keep him safe. The clearing had turned into a war zone. Trees groaned and splintered as they crashed to the ground, leaves and branches exploding into the air like shrapnel. The ground shook violently under the weight of the two colossal dinosaurs locked in combat, their roars echoing through the jungle like rolling thunder. Jake stood frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he watched Rexy face off against the new predator. The other dinosaur was massive, even larger than Rexy, its scales a deep, menacing black, its eyes glowing red like embers. Every movement was sharp, violent, and deliberate, its powerful jaws snapping dangerously close to Rexy's neck. Rexy lunged forward, his roar piercing through the chaos. He rammed his massive body into the predator, sending it stumbling back into the jungle, where it crushed another tree under its weight. But the creature didn't stay down for long. It snarled, shaking off the blow as it turned its blazing red eyes back toward Rexy. "Rexy!" Jake shouted, his voice breaking. He wanted to help, to do something, anything, but what could he possibly do against two creatures that could flatten him with a single step? "Jake, we have to move!" Tyler's voice snapped him back to reality. Tyler grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away from the fight. "We can't stay here. That thing is going to kill us all. I can't leave him," Jake yelled, yanking his arm free. "He's protecting us. Jake, look at them," Tyler shouted, pointing toward the fight. "Do you really think he's going to win? That thing is twice his size. If we don't leave now, we're next." Jake hesitated, his heart pounding painfully in his chest as he watched Rexy. The T-Rex let out another earth-shaking roar as he lunged at the predator, his powerful jaws snapping shut around the creature's shoulder. The predator roared in pain, thrashing violently as it tried to shake Rexy loose. Jake clenched his fists, his voice shaking with desperation. "Come on, Rexy, you can do this," but deep down, doubt crept into his mind. Tyler was right. This new dinosaur was bigger, stronger, and faster. Rexy was fighting with everything he had, but he was getting tired. Jake could see it in the way his movements slowed, the way his roars sounded more strained. Another roar, louder, more ferocious, rang through the clearing as the black-scaled predator twisted, throwing Rexy to the ground with a sickening crash. The earth shook violently, and Jake staggered, his knees nearly buckling. "No!" Jake screamed, his throat raw. Rexy struggled to push himself back up, his golden eyes narrowing as the predator stalked toward him. The creature's jaws opened wide, its teeth gleaming in the moonlight as it prepared to strike. "Get away from him!" Jake shouted, his voice breaking with panic. And then, without thinking, he ran. "Jake, what are you doing?" Tyler yelled behind him, but Jake didn't stop. He sprinted toward Rexy, his feet pounding against the uneven ground as the predator loomed closer. He didn't have a plan, he didn't know what he was going to do. But he couldn't just stand there and watch Rexy die. "Hey!" Jake screamed, waving his arms as he skidded to a stop between the predator and Rexy. "Over here, you ugly lizard! Come get me!" The predator froze, its glowing red eyes snapping toward Jake. For a moment, the jungle went silent, as though even the trees were holding their breath. "Jake, get out of there!" Tyler's voice was distant now, lost in the pounding of Jake's heart. The predator let out a guttural snarl, its massive head swinging toward Jake. Its jaws opened, and for a split second, Jake saw his reflection in those glowing red eyes. He knew he was about to die, but then, a roar, louder, deeper, fiercer than before. Rexy, the T-Rex, pushed himself up with a force that shook the earth, his massive body slamming into the predator with the strength of a battering ram. The predator screeched in surprise, stumbling back as Rexy snapped his jaws around its neck. Jake fell backward, scrambling to get out of the way as the two dinosaurs clashed again. This time, Rexy didn't hold back. He bit down harder, his muscles rippling with effort as the predator thrashed and snarled, trying to break free. "Come on, Rexy," Jake whispered, his voice shaking. "You've got this." Rexy let out a roar that sounded like victory. With one final, powerful twist of his head, he threw the predator to the ground. The creature hit the earth with a deafening crash, its snarls fading into silence. It didn't get up. For a moment, the clearing was quiet. Jake sat frozen on the ground, his chest heaving as he stared at Rexy. The dinosaur stood tall, his golden eyes scanning the predator's still form before turning toward Jake. His sides heaved with exhaustion, but there was something triumphant in his gaze. Something that said, "I told you I'd protect you." Jake let out a shaky laugh, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. "You did it," he whispered. "You really did it." Rexy let out a soft, rumbling huff, his tail swishing behind him as he stepped toward Jake. The dinosaur lowered his massive head, his golden eyes calm as they locked onto Jake's. Jake reached out with trembling hands, resting his palm against Rexy's snout. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me. Again." Rexy huffed softly, as though brushing off the praise, and Jake smiled through his tears. "Jake!" He turned to see Tyler and the others emerging cautiously from the trees, their faces pale and their eyes wide with disbelief. What just happened?" Tyler stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake stood slowly, his hands still resting on Rexy's snout. "He saved us," Jake said firmly. "He saved all of us." Tyler stared at him, then at Rexy, who stood calmly beside Jake, his massive form illuminated by the faint glow of the rising moon. "That thing, it killed the other one." "He protected us," Jake corrected, his voice steady. "Because he's not what you think he is. He's not a monster. He's my friend." Tyler opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. The others murmured softly among themselves, their expressions a mix of fear and awe as they looked at Rexy. Finally, Tyler let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "This is insane," he muttered. "Completely insane." Jake smiled faintly. "Maybe, but it's the truth." The camp was silent that night, the team too shaken to sleep. Jake stayed close to Rexy, his back against the dinosaur's massive side as he stared up at the stars. He couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. The fight, Rexy's strength, his unwavering loyalty. "You really are something else," Jake whispered, his voice soft. Rexy let out a low, rumbling huff in response, his golden eyes half closed as though he were finally allowing himself to rest. Jake smiled faintly, his gaze drifting back to the sky. He didn't know what the future held, whether they would find a way to keep Rexy safe, or if someone would come looking for him. But for now, it didn't matter, because in that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the jungle and the steady rhythm of Rexy's breathing, Jake knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone, and neither was Rexy. Dawn broke over the jungle, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. The once chaotic clearing was now calm, the ground scarred from the clash of titans that had shaken the earth only hours before. Jake sat near the fire, his knees pulled to his chest as he watched Rexy sleep peacefully nearby. The enormous dinosaur's body rose and fell with every slow breath, his golden eyes closed in much-needed rest. Tyler and the others were still awake, their quiet murmurs barely audible from across the camp. They hadn't come close to Rexy again, keeping their distance as though afraid he might wake up and turn on them. But Jake knew better. He knew Rexy wasn't a threat. Not to him and not to anyone who didn't give him a reason to fight. "Jake!" Tyler's voice broke through the quiet, and Jake looked up to see him approaching. The man's expression was cautious, his steps slow as he glanced nervously at Rexy. "What is it?" Jake asked, his voice tired. Tyler stopped a few feet away, shoving his hands into his pockets. "We need to talk about what happens next." Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew this conversation was coming. "I figured." Tyler hesitated, his gaze flicking toward Rexy before settling back on Jake. "Look, I'll admit it, you were right about him. He's not like anything I've ever seen before. He saved our lives last night. I can't deny that." Jake raised an eyebrow. "But," Tyler let out a breath, "but we can't keep him hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone's going to come looking for us. And when they find Rexy," he trailed off, his meaning clear. Jake's stomach twisted painfully. He knew Tyler was right. Rexy was an impossibility, an ancient creature brought to life, a living miracle. The world would never leave him alone. Governments would want to capture him. Scientists would want to study him. Hunters would want to kill him. Rexy would never be safe. "I can't let that happen," Jake said softly, his voice trembling. Tyler frowned. "What are you going to do, Jake? You can't just keep running forever." Jake looked at Rexy, his golden eyes still closed in sleep. The dinosaur seemed so peaceful, so innocent. For all his size and power, Rexy was gentle, loyal, and protective, qualities that most people would never see if they judged him by his appearance alone. "I don't know," Jake admitted finally, "but I'll figure something out. I have to." Tyler shook his head. "You're talking like you're responsible for him." Jake's jaw tightened. "I am responsible for him. He saved my life, Tyler. More than once. I owe him everything." Tyler sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Look, I get it. You care about him. But we're running out of time. If we don't do something soon, someone else will make the decision for us. Then we'll leave," Jake said firmly, standing up. "We'll go deeper into the jungle. Somewhere no one can find us." Tyler stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Jake, listen to yourself. This isn't a game. You can't just disappear into the jungle with a dinosaur." Jake didn't respond. He couldn't, not without letting his emotions get the better of him. Instead, he turned and walked toward Rexy, his boots crunching softly against the dirt. By mid-morning, the team had packed up the camp, their movements tense and quiet. Tyler didn't push the issue again, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time. He could feel the weight of the unspoken questions hanging in the air. What would they do? How would they keep Rexy safe? As Jake crouched beside Rexy, gently patting the dinosaur's snout to wake him, a new idea began to form in his mind. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. Rexy's golden eyes blinked open slowly, and he let out a low rumble, almost like a sigh. Jake smiled faintly. "Morning, big guy. Time to move." Rexy pushed himself up with a soft huff, his massive form rising until he stood tall once more. The ground trembled slightly under his weight, but to Jake it was a familiar sound, reassuring, even. "Jake," Sarah said softly, walking up behind him. "What are you thinking?" Jake turned to her, his expression determined. "I think we need to let Rexy choose what happens next." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Jake glanced at the jungle beyond the clearing, the endless green stretching as far as the eye could see. "We can't take him with us, and we can't keep hiding him forever. But this is his home, his world. Maybe he knows where he belongs." Sarah hesitated, then nodded slowly. "And if he doesn't? Then I'll stay with him," Jake said firmly. "As long as he needs me." They walked for hours, the group following Jake and Rexy as they made their way deeper into the jungle. The path was rough and wild, untouched by human hands. Vines hung low from the trees, and thick roots twisted across the ground like the veins of the earth itself. Jake led the way, his hand resting on Rexy's side as they moved. The dinosaur walked calmly beside him, his golden eyes scanning the trees with quiet awareness. It was as though Rexy knew this was his chance. A chance to find his place, his purpose. "Where are we going?" Tyler called out from behind, his voice tinged with frustration. "I don't know," Jake replied, glancing over his shoulder. "Wherever Rexy takes us." Tyler groaned but didn't argue. The others followed in silence, their curiosity outweighing their doubts. Eventually, they reached a wide clearing bordered by towering cliffs. A waterfall cascaded down the rocks, its water pooling into a clear, blue lake surrounded by lush greenery. The air was cool and damp, the sound of rushing water filling the silence. Rexy stopped at the edge of the clearing, his golden eyes fixed on the lake. For a long moment he stood still, his tail swishing gently as though lost in thought. Then, without warning, he let out a deep, resonant roar that echoed through the cliffs, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Jake froze, his heart pounding as the sound reverberated through the clearing. It wasn't a roar of anger or aggression. It was something else, something deeper. And then they heard it. An answer. From somewhere in the distance, Another roar echoed back, faint but unmistakable. Jake's breath caught in his throat as Rexy turned toward him, his golden eyes gleaming with something Jake couldn't quite describe. Hope, belonging. You hear that? Jake whispered, his voice trembling. They're out there. Others like you. Rexy huffed softly, his tail swishing behind him as he turned back toward the sound. Without hesitation, he began to move, his massive form disappearing into the thick foliage on the far side of the clearing. Jake watched him go, his chest tight with emotion. Part of him wanted to run after Rexy, to stay by his side no matter what. But he knew this was where Rexy belonged, with others of his kind, in a place untouched by humans. Tyler stepped up beside him, his voice quiet. Is this it, then? You're letting him go? Jake nodded, his throat tight. Yeah. He's not alone anymore. For a long moment, no one spoke. The jungle was quiet again, the only sound the distant rush of the waterfall. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Do you think we'll ever see him again? Jake smiled faintly, his eyes fixed on the spot where Rexy had disappeared. Maybe, he said softly, but even if we don't, I'll know he's out there. Safe. Free. The team stood in silence as the sun rose higher in the sky, its light filtering through the trees and casting dappled shadows across the clearing. Jake turned away from the jungle, his heart full. Rexy had saved him, shown him what loyalty, trust, and friendship truly meant. And now it was Jake's turn to give something back. Goodbye, Rexy, he whispered, his voice carrying softly on the breeze. Thank you. As the group began the long journey back, Jake couldn't help but glance over his shoulder one last time. The jungle stretched endlessly before him, its secrets hidden in the shadows. But somewhere out there, he knew Rexy was watching, and that was enough.